You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, and welcome to another episode of SLA Insights. My name is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and we're talking about vocabulary learning recently. And today I want to spend the episode discussing all things vocabulary flashcard related. The good news is that SLA research has indicated that flashcards really are a very effective way for learning vocabulary items. And so we're going to dive into that and look at some of the things that will be most helpful and most effective, making those vocabulary flashcards most effective, but then also looking at some variations and so on that you can use as you learn vocabulary through flashcards. Now, vocabulary learning through the use of flashcards is going to be a form of direct vocabulary learning, something that I talked about in the previous episode, as opposed to indirect vocabulary learning, where you're learning words from context. Direct learning is intentional and conscious, where you're focusing on, in this case, memorizing vocabulary words from those cards. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you're learning vocabulary, repetition is going to be key, because one exposure to a vocabulary word does not mean that you have learned it. In fact, you get to 5 or 10, you're just starting to learn the word. It's only when you get to 50 to 70 repetitions, exposures to that single word, that you're going to really start knowing the vocabulary word. So flashcards are one way to get in a number of repetitions and exposures to these new words. So I'm going to kind of lay out for you a procedure, and I'm sure many of you have already used flashcards and have some idea of what I'm talking about. So some of this may be redundant, but there's also going to be some details, some hints, and some variations, as I said, to how you do flashcards that I hope will be helpful and make your flashcard learning more effective. So we're going to start with word selection. You start with the words you want to be studying. Now, ideally, you want to go by frequency, beginning with high frequency words. And when you're looking at biblical languages, for example, the corpus is set. We only have so many words in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And so we know which words we can easily come up with, which ones are the most frequent, to start there. But that's not the only way. You may be looking at a chapter of your new textbook and you want to be learning the words in that particular chapter. Or maybe you're studying a particular passage of Scripture and you want to learn the words just for that passage or chapter that you're studying. So those are some criteria for how to choose the words you want to study. You're also going to want to select the number of words, not just the range of words, but the number of words. If you've got more difficult words in your stack of flashcards, then you're going to need to do fewer words at a time. If they're easier words for you, then you can do more words in your stack. The other issue related to vocabulary, choosing the words that you're going to study, is to avoid interference. And I talked about this in a previous episode, that there's some words that you really should avoid learning together. So, for example, words that look or sound alike, you don't want to put in the same stack of flashcards. Words that belong to the same lexical set. So, for example, animals or body parts or types of trees or types of food, you don't want to put those in the same stack of flashcards to learn them together, especially at the initial stages of learning, which is what vocabulary flashcards usually are for. Later on, you may want to bring them together to compare, contrast, and so on. But at the time you're doing flashcards, you really don't want that kind of interference in your learning. You'll also want to avoid synonyms or near synonyms. Think of words like agape and phileo in Greek. You don't want to put those together at the same time, to learn them at least at first at the same time. And similarly, antonyms, you don't want to put big and small in the same stack of flashcards. You want to avoid interference when you're choosing flashcards to learn together at the same time. The next thing then, once you've chosen the words that you want to study, then you're going to create your cards. And I'm going to start by explaining handmade index cards, although, there are other ways of doing it, and I'll get to that later. But for now, I'm assuming that you're writing your own flashcards. And so on one side, you're going to put the new L2 word, whatever your second language is. If you're studying Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Spanish, whatever it is, you put that on one side, and you put your L1 meaning on the opposite side where you can't see it. And again, L1 being your native language, assuming English here, but whatever your native language is. Now, one caveat here, be careful and be aware that any L1 gloss is going to be an oversimplification of the meaning of the L2 word. So if you want to put several glosses, if you want to write a sentence description that would be more accurate for helping you learn the L2 word, you can do that. But a single word, a gloss, can be helpful because it's quick and easy. But just keep in mind, you're only learning one component of the word if you do that. Now, at this point, there's some options, some variations that you can do in creating your flashcards. You could, for example, put grammatical information with the L2 word on the first side. So you might put on there part of speech, gender, principal parts if we're talking verbs, things like that that will help you learn the word more deeply. So you're not just learning a simple one-to-one correspondence, but you're starting to learn more of the aspects of that L2 word. Another variation you could use is to include color coding. So, for example, pink for feminine nouns and blue for masculine nouns. You might use yellow for prepositions or green for neuter. Those kinds of things will also help trigger your memory and help you learn more deeply. Another option would be to put that word in a sentence, in an L2 sentence, on the front side of the card. That will help you learn usage, context, collocations, and will lean into the indirect type of learning for vocabulary. Because one-to-one correspondence, if you just do the word with the gloss on the opposite side, it's more of a direct kind of instruction. But if you include the word in a sentence, then you're starting to move into the more indirect type of vocabulary learning, which is a good, as I mentioned in the previous episode, a good way to balance the learning and to help each type of learning back and forth. Another option, another possible variation, instead of using an L1 meaning or gloss on the backside, you could bypass the native language entirely and use a photo or a diagram. This, of course, doesn't work for everything, but for many, especially concrete nouns and simple verbs, you can put in a photo, a diagram, and it helps to make a more direct form-meaning connection in your brain because you've now bypassed L1. You're getting really at the heart of the meaning of that L2 word. The other advantage here is that the act of drawing the photo or the diagram could strengthen and deepen the memory trace, leading to a more secure retrieval of that item as you work through learning. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to transition now to the use of computerized flashcards and or store-bought flashcards. Because many people think, if I write it down, I'm going to remember it better. And that there is some truth to that, but let me tease that out just a little bit for you. The act of writing your own flashcards can have some advantages, but it seems that the advantages are not significant enough to avoid flashcards made by others. So if you want to buy flashcards, if you want to use them on the computer, some computerized flashcards, you can do that without losing too much at all. It seems that the repeated writing of words does not significantly add to vocabulary learning. So if you purchase cards or computerized cards, they can be just as effective as handwritten cards minus one exposure to the new word. So when you write it, that counts as one exposure. And so if you use a computerized card, you've lost one exposure, which is not a huge loss, depending on your time and availability and so on. So if you want to use computerized flashcards, pre-made flashcards, feel free to do so. Just, make up for it by one more time through the flashcards. That's kind of the bottom line for that. Now, we've talked about how to select words. We've talked about how to create your flashcards and some of the variations you could use in doing that. Now we're going to talk about practice. That is, how do you use them? And you, again, want to adjust the number of cards based on difficulty. If you've got a lot of difficult words or they're all new words, then you're going to start with fewer cards. If they're easier words, you've seen them a lot, you're going to use more cards at a time. The idea is then that you go through the stack 2 or 3 times, looking at the L2 side, the language you're learning, and trying to remember the L1 gloss on the other side before you flip it over to check. And you want to go through the entire stack 2 or 3 times, even if you know some of them, okay? That gives you more exposure to those words, more practice, repetition. Again, repetition is key here for vocabulary learning. Then you're going to go through on the 3rd or 4th time through the stack again, and this time start separating out the known words. So you're going to have an active stack, those that needs to be studied more because you don't get them or you don't get them right away or you don't get them quite right, and then a completed stack separated off to the side of the words that you have in fact learned, and you can say it, right away, and then go through the stack again and keep doing it until you've worked through all the active stack has all moved into the completed stack, and then go through it one more time, the whole stack one more time. And so this is relying on some factors that are related to vocabulary acquisition. That is repetition, again, repetition, key to vocab, but also spaced retrieval. So again, repetition is important. I said 5 to 7 times, 5 to 10 times for solid learning, but 20 to 50 to 70 even for a full round, robust understanding of that item. But spaced retrieval is not something I've talked about significantly here. Spaced retrieval means giving some time in between your exposures. So not just repetition all in the same half hour, but repetition now, again in a couple hours, again in a couple days, and so on, because the spaced presentation of the words will enhance the memory. It results in more secure learning than a massed repetition all at the same time. So you're going to separate them out. In other words, time between study sessions, so maybe a couple hours, a couple days, but also the time between encounters of a single word within the study session. And this comes about by that adjusting the number of cards. You've learned it, and then you break it up and see it again later. You need time between the first and second encounter especially. So don't go through the stack immediately after making your cards, for example. Most forgetting occurs after the initial learning. As time passes, the rate of forgetting becomes slower. Now, the ideal pattern of spaced repetition or spaced retrievals is not exactly agreed upon, but here's the general principle. That is, successful but difficult retrievals are better for memory than successful but easy retrievals. So you need to put the space enough that you almost forget it, but you can still successfully remember. So if if you're doing the vocab, or if your student fails to recall a word, then the interval needs to be shortened. But if the student recalls correctly and quickly, then the delay should be increased. And of course, it's going to vary depending on the word you know. And there are electronic flashcards out there that will make the adjustment for you. They know if you're doing it correctly, how quickly you're responding, and will actually make that adjustment for the spaced retrieval. Okay, so now you've gone through and you've done L2 to L1. Now, the next part is to reverse it. You now flip the cards over so that L1 is showing, your native language is showing, and you now try to retrieve the new word, the L2 word, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, whatever it is. And again, start with small stacks, work up to larger stacks as it gets easier so you can create more and more of that spaced retrieval. So that's the basic procedure. A few other variations that I would recommend that I think would be helpful. One is to say the L2 words out loud as you're studying them. This is going to further stimulate your phonological loop of working memory and encourage more long-term memory storage. Another suggestion would be to practice by putting the L2 word in a sentence as you're learning, again, for deeper, richer learning of that vocabulary item. So with that in mind, we've come to the end now of the different practices and the ways to use flashcards most effectively, how to make them, how to use them, and some variations to help, because it's not just the repetition, but the repetition in different ways, in different contexts, in different approaches that's going to make an even deeper effective learning for your vocabulary word. So for upcoming episodes now, I'm going to start looking at a few other specific vocabulary learning strategies and activities. I hope you can join me for those. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.